For decades, the story of China's economy was one of rapid growth, dramatic poverty reduction, and the promise of shared prosperity. Beginning in the late 1970s, the country's economic reforms transformed it from a largely agrarian, low-income nation into the world's second-largest economy. Hundreds of millions were lifted out of poverty, and ordinary households experienced a substantial increase in living standards. But beneath the surface of this remarkable success, a troubling trend has emerged. Inequality in China has been rising for years. Today, the gap between the wealthy and the rest of the population is large and persistent. Urban billionaires, tech entrepreneurs, and property moguls enjoy lifestyles comparable to the richest individuals anywhere in the world. Meanwhile, vast swathes of the population, especially rural residents, migrant workers, and those living in China's less developed interior provinces, lag far behind in income, wealth, and access to essential services. Here's a graph on the distribution of income across richer and poorer groups, before tax, from 1979 to 2022, data that we got from the World Inequality database. As you can see from the graph right here, back in 1979, the richest 1% of China held only 6.5%, whereas the middle held 47.1%, and the poorest with a share of 25.1%. But decades later, by 2022, the share of the 1% has substantially increased. They now hold a share of 15.7%, more than double than what it was back in 1979, whilst the middle holds just 42.9%, and the poorest holding just 13.7%. It may not really make sense using percentages, so let's put this into simplicity. Let's take a $100 bill, for example. If we were to represent the distribution of wealth using a $100 bill, here's how it would look based on the data. In 1979, out of that $100, the richest 1% would hold $6.50. The middle 40% of the population would have $47.10, and the poorest 50% would have $25.10. Fast forward to 2022, and the richest 1% would now hold $15.70, more than doubling their share, while the middle would see their share shrink to $42.90, and the poorest half of the population would be left with only $13.70. This increased divide is, of course, questionable. Why? That's because China is a communist nation. What that basically means is that the principles of communism, in theory, advocate for the equitable distribution of wealth and resources. The state, under a communist framework, is expected to act as a central mechanism for minimizing class disparities and ensuring that economic benefits reach everyone. This sharp rise in inequality seems to contradict these foundational ideals and raises questions about the direction of China's economic policies and governance. You may think that just because China's inequality has risen, it shouldn't already put it in the same spots like some Western nations, where inequality rates are becoming problematic. As a matter of fact, China's inequality has actually surpassed many Western economies and is catching up to the United States. How so? Well, here's the income share of the richest 1% in China. As you can see, the income share of the richest 1% has risen indeed, which is what we just saw earlier. But this time, let's add the United States, France, the United Kingdom, and even Japan. As you can see, back in 1981, the income share of the richest 1% in China was lower than most of these nations, except for the United Kingdom. China had a 6.9% share, whereas Japan had over 10.3% and France at 8.3%. But fast forward to 2022, China's share more than doubled at 15.7%, putting its income share the second highest in this graph, just behind the United States. So much for aiming to become an equal nation, right? Well, let's now understand what has happened to China. The inequality of China way back in the 1940s, which was the founding of the People's Republic of China, was relatively low. China was under the leadership of Mao Zedong, a man who championed collectivist ideals and sought to create an egalitarian society through radical social and economic policies. During Mao's leadership, land reforms redistributed property from landlords to peasants, and industries were nationalized. The emphasis was placed on collective farming and state-owned enterprises, aiming to eliminate class distinctions and promote equality across the population. These words, however, might be too difficult to truly understand. So, let's simplify everything. Under Mao, China's economy worked like one big team project. Imagine a village where everyone shares the land, grows crops together, and splits the harvest equally. Nobody owns more than their neighbor, and the goal is for everyone to have enough to live on. Mao's land reforms were like taking a big pie that used to be owned by just a few landlords and slicing it evenly for everyone in the village. And factories and businesses were treated the same way. They were owned by the state, which meant that profits weren't going to one person or family, but were used for the benefit of the whole country. This setup aimed to make sure no one was left behind. Hence, as you can see, China's inequality rate since then may have indeed been low. A few decades later, however, when Deng Xiaoping initiated the reform and opening up policies, saw the start of a rapid industrialization in China, along with massive influx of foreign investment and an export-led growth. It was these years that led to China's economic rise to where it is today. You can even view that from their exports of goods and services as a percentage of GDP. Here, as you can see in the graph, data that we got from the World Bank shows that in 1979, the exports of goods and services as a percentage of GDP in 1979 was just 7.8%. But since this year, the exports have continuously grown, with some contractions seen in some years, but it still shows the start of these reforms that led to China's manufacturing rise. These measures brought tremendous growth, but also disrupted the old, relatively equal economic order. While many benefited from the new opportunities, some regions and groups pulled ahead faster than others. Here's a map of China, and if you're well knowledgeable of China, you can already tell which province is richer than others. For instance, the GDP per capita of Beijing is approximately $28,000 in 2023, while the province of Qinghai sits at just approximately $9,000. That's a big difference, a gap of nearly 3 times between one of the wealthiest regions and one of the poorer ones. And this is true for a lot of other provinces out there, where some like Guangdong, Shanghai, Jiangsu, and so on have far higher GDP per capita, while others like Tibet, Yunnan, and Guizhou have far less. This is the result of many reasons, but one of these is largely due to the economic reforms and opening up of China, where some provinces got richer, while others benefiting minimally. That is the first reason why inequality rose in China. The second reason that we see is what China calls the Hukou system. What this is for is that it acts as a household registration system that categorizes individuals as either urban or rural residents. It was introduced back in the 1950s and was designed to control internal migration and ensure that resources were allocated efficiently within the planned economy. Under this Hukou system, an individual's access to public services, such as education, healthcare, and social welfare, is tied to their place of registration. For example, a family registered in rural Guizhou but living and working in Guangzhou, one of China's wealthiest cities, faces significant barriers. Despite contributing to Guangzhou's booming economy, they cannot access local public schools, affordable healthcare, or social welfare programs. Their children might have to return to Guizhou for education, where resources are far scarcer, and healthcare options in their hometown are limited compared to the advanced facilities available in Guangzhou. Here's a graph on China's urban population and urban Hukou population, data that we got from the Statistical Yearbook of China 2020. As you can see from the graph, back in 2010, about 50% of China's population, or roughly 669.8 million people, lived in urban areas. By 2020, this figure had risen to 902 million, or nearly 64% of the population. This shift is quite remarkable, considering it's just a decade ago. But the share of people holding a formal urban hukou, entitling them to full rights and benefits in their city of residence, lagged behind. In 2010, 459.6 million people, about 34.3% of the total population, held urban hukou. By 2020, this number grew to 640.9 million, 45.4%, an increase, but still well below the total urban population. In other words, while more people lived in cities, not all of them had the official status needed to access benefits and services. Thirdly, and finally, one last big problem that we see for China is their real estate. Over the past few decades, China has seen one of the most dramatic housing booms in history. You may have already caught a glimpse of China's real estate market due to its recent issues. But for historical sake, let's take in some of the biggest real estate companies in China and graph their total revenue out, which is basically how much the company's sales are. Here, as you can see in the graph, the total revenue of Country Garden, one of China's biggest real estate companies. You can see just how big their revenues were and how fast it grew. Evergrande, of course, is that Chinese company that fell to the ground. But before it did fall, the company and other real estate businesses out there pushed a wealth concentration housing in China. The families who bought into richer cities like Shanghai and Beijing a decade ago found their wealth multiplied. The newcomers, younger individuals, and rural migrants were then priced out of the market because of this rise. Just how hard was it to buy a property in Beijing? Well, here's the median housing affordability. Price-to-income ratio in formal private housing, city, in China. Data that we got from a research paper published in 2020. As you can see, Beijing has a price-to-income ratio of over 16.9, which is so much more than Leshan, Sichuan, at only 3.2. A price-to-income ratio of over 16.9 in Beijing means that a middle-income family would, on average, need to dedicate more than 16 years' worth of their total annual income just to purchase a home, assuming they spend every yuan earned toward the property, which is, of course, unrealistic. This housing issue is compounded by what we said earlier. The Hukou system, since migrants do not have full urban residency rights, they often cannot access subsidized housing or public rental units, forcing them into the more expensive private rental market or pushing them to live in less desirable areas. Now that we have an understanding of the causes of China's inequality, let's now talk about Xi Jinping. But before that, it is first important to know that there are many, many reasons for China's rising inequality. These are just some of them. So, why talk about President Xi Jinping? Well, in recent years, policymakers in Beijing have been keenly aware of rising inequality and the risks it poses to social stability and economic growth. This led to Xi Jinping's emphasis on common prosperity, which basically signals the government's intent to redistribute wealth more evenly and ensure that everyone benefits from modernization. Since this was announced, many changes have been made. For instance, several large companies have pledged hefty donations to social causes. For example, in 2021, a major Chinese tech conglomerate announced a 50 billion yuan, $7.7 billion fund aimed at common prosperity initiatives. But unfortunately, there are still many challenges that will come along, and all we can do is wait out on the actual results that Xi Jinping may have. But anyway, do let us know what you think. Thanks for watching.